Hi, hope everyone had a lovely lunch. Glad to be back with you. So thank you for coming in, Ms. Briggs Campbell. We had a number of conversations last session about federal funds and school districts and how that intersects with the amount of money that school districts need to raise to meet students' needs. And so ask you to give us an update on how all that federal money is getting spent at the district level. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Jill Briggs Campbell, Agency of Education. I'm very happy to be here in person instead of in Zoom form. So yes, I'm happy to speak to how our districts are using these ESSER funds. I had sent over a slide deck that probably had more information than you needed on the state set aside dollars, which I'm also happy to talk about. But I have an abbreviated version looking more at what's happening in the local districts. So a lot of overlap. There's nothing in what I'm going to be looking at that isn't in the slide deck that you already have. I think the first thing I'd like to do is sort of step back one step. You've probably heard of these ESSER dollars, but maybe don't swim in this alphabet soup as much as I do. So there's some common terms I think it's helpful to define that you'll be hearing me say. The first is, what is ESSER? Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. We never call it that, we just call it ESSER. And there's three flavors. There's ESSER 1, which came out of the CARES Act in 2020. It was sort of our first of the COVID federal emergency funds for schools. Then there was ESSER 2, which came out of the CARISA Act in December of 2021. And then, of course, the ARP ESSER, which, we can speak to how those numbers have increased over time, but the ARP ESSER came with the ARPA Act in March of 2021. So those are the three main tranches of funding that our school districts have received. There's other programs as well, but we don't want to go down into that that particular level, but there's funds that are going to our CTE centers. There's funds specifically for child nutrition. There's all kinds of other programs. You will also see in the slide deck, and you'll hear me use these interchangeably, and it's just force of habit, but the term LEA will be used. I will try not to. I will try to use SU or SD, but those two things are sort of interchangeable here.
Can you even remind us what it is?
Yeah, so an LEA is a local education entity. So from the federal perspective, which is where I always have to operate, that is who receives the bulk of these funds. 90% of the ESSER dollars go directly to local education entities. In Vermont, that's our supervisory union or district, so our SU and SD level. And then the SEA is the Agency of Education, the state education entity, or state education agency. So as I said, I will try to use SU and SD, but force of habit, I may use LEA. Those two things are the same. And then
Sorry, just to clarify, the presentation that you're working from is the LEA fund updates?
Yeah, I'm going to work from that one.
Okay, thank you.
Simplified.
And so if folks aren't pulling it up again, refresh.
Yeah, that's right. It just got reposted. So
Thank you.
see that one. All right, and then the third term that you'll hear me use pretty frequently is period of performance. And that's when we're talking about fiscal cliffs and planning for future budgeting, it's the period of performance that's really critical. When we are speaking grant speak, period of performance is the period of time in which an SU or SD needs to obligate or encumber its funds. So there is a little bit of, I think, a disconnect that's happened nationally around these funds, the difference between funds being expended and obligated. And what counts here is obligated. Because these are reimbursement grants, a district can encumber these funds. They could have a contract. They could have hired a position. They could be doing that big HVAC project. They've obligated their funds. Those are approved in a grant award, and they've gone out and they've encumbered them. They no longer have access to them, but they don't have to seek reimbursement from the Agency of Education until after the period of performance ends. So when we're looking at this, we don't want to say, oh no, they haven't expended all their funds. that's not an accurate read of where things stand. So that sort of brings me to, we've developed a couple of dashboards to help folks with this. I just want to point to this. It's a very fancy new tool. I'm very proud of it. If you go onto our Agency of Education, Education Recovery and Revitalization webpage, we have a district level dashboard that you can go in and peruse at your pleasure. You can take a look and see your local supervisory union or district. Where are they at in terms of have they obligated their ESSER, well, ESSER 1 is done, but have they obligated their ESSER 2 funds? Have they obligated their ARP ESSER funds? And you can also look and see at what rate they're actually expending them. But again, I just want to caution that if you go in there and you look at ESSER 2, you might say, oh no, my district really isn't expending their funds. That may not actually be an accurate representation of where they stand in terms of they have actually obligated, they've made commitments for these funds, but they haven't sought reimbursement and been paid out for them yet. So those dashboards are available. We also have a state level in case you're interested in looking at the ways that the Agency of Education is using our sort of set aside dollars. So when we're talking about these dollar amounts, it is a large amount of funding. It's a historic amount of funding. So initially with the ESSER 1 funds, we were talking about $28 million roughly going to our supervisory unions and districts. And we all said, wow, that's a lot of money. And then ESSER 2 came along and it was $114 million going to our supervisory unions and districts. And then ARP ESSER came along and that's $256 million going to our supervisory unions and districts. And those are generated by formula that comes from the federal government. It's largely based on title funding structures that are just sort of reused for this. And it's an allocation formula. It's largely driven by poverty metrics. So that's how those funds go out. And there are different periods of performance. So the ESSER 1 period of performance ended in September of 2022. And districts have submitted their final closeout reports. That means their very last reimbursement requests. And the Agency of Education has until January 30th to make those final payments. So in terms of ESSER 1, done, complete, that one's done. And the good news to share is that our districts almost entirely spent those funds. And we're talking about the amounts remaining were very, very small. So that's good news. There's been this question of, can they possibly expend these funds? And, our first round of evidence here is yes, they can expend these funds and they are expending these funds. When we look at ESSER 2, they're also looking on track to do this, $114 million. So far, we've paid $72 million, and we know, because we required them to do so, that they have fully budgeted their allocations and have gone through the approval process with AOE. So that means they have fully budgeted awards. We know that they have a plan for how they're going to spend these funds. They're in the process of doing so. Those end September 30th of this year. So they've got some work to do, but they appear to be on track, and we feel fairly confident about that. The other thing I'll say is, of course, we have told them to spend the dollar that expires first, right? So we would expect that they would still have a lot of ARP ESSER dollars sitting in the bank because we've told them spend the other dollars first. And then finally, with the ARP ESSER dollars, so that's that $256 million, we have only paid out about $25 million. But again, what we know is that they have fully budgeted their allocations because we required them to do so. So as of November 1st, they had to submit their ARP ESSER applications fully budgeted, and everyone has received their award at this point. They have all the way through August of 2024 to make amendments to those, but they have to maintain that full budget the whole time. So in terms of our confidence about whether or not they have a plan, they know how they're planning to spend these funds, we can say with confidence that we do because we've reviewed all of their applications. So that is sort of the current status of those. And I think at this point, we can also speak to how they're spending these dollars. Is that?
That is
Okay, that's where you wanted me to go.
waiting with bated breath for 2 years to hear. I'm so excited.
Okay, I know, I have also been waiting. We're getting the data. So, and a lot of this is actually captured in the dashboard, so I encourage you in all of your spare time to go and peruse through there, and it's all broken down by spending category. Those spending categories are actually tied to their budgets in really boring but objective ways to their budget codes. So we're able to sort of pull that information up. So again, ESSER 1, they almost 100% expended their dollars, which was great news. What we can say is that they are focusing on using the bulk of their ESSER funds, all 3 funds, to support student learning and the impacts of the pandemic, which is, I think, what we would all hope to see, right? So 53% of total spending is going towards the codes that are tied to academic instruction. Some of that's salary and benefits, some of it's contracted services. A good portion of it is special education services, education technology, assessment. So those things that are really specifically tied to student learning. The second,
And when you see that happening, do you see that replacing existing budget line items that were going towards those purposes or in excess of existing?
it's a mix. Yeah. So early on, we definitely saw those replacements happening. I think out of an abundance of caution, not understanding what the Ed Fund picture was going to look like. One thing that is unique about these ESSER funds is that there is no supplement, not supplant clause. It's very unusual. Okay, and you all nodded your heads, which I love. All right, so just generally speaking, that means you can't use $1 to pay for a position that, is going to be ongoing. That does create the opportunity to use ESSER funds to pay for positions that are otherwise funded with no penalty down the line. So we may see that literacy interventionist that they've added, or maybe they've already had, was maybe paid for with a local dollar or with a federal title fund dollar. They could go back to those funds after the ESSER fund ends. If they've added new positions, which I think is probably a concern, is how do they pay for that ongoing obligation should they choose to continue the position?
And do you have deeper analysis that you could share with us about that level of district spending? Districts that you've seen sort of spend more on top with ESSER money,
Yes.
districts that aren't?
So we have just signed a contract because we identified that there was a need for this level of analysis. So I would say that over the past 2 years, especially in the last year, the conversation around the FY25 budget and the fiscal cliff is heating up, but has not necessarily been as widespread of a conversation. I think I would chalk that up almost entirely to the ongoing pandemic response and capacity within the districts. They are running razor thin, and they've been running at 200 miles an hour for 2.5 years. I would say that actually applies to the Agency of Education as well. So recognizing this, particularly in late summer, we put out a contract and we have signed a contract, and the work is underway with APA Consulting to do exactly that level of analysis. And I actually just met with them for coffee just a moment ago. So the plan there is for them to do an in-depth analysis of all ESSER budgets to identify areas of what we're calling fiscal exposure. That may be staffing, it may be major infrastructure investments that will have ongoing maintenance costs. It may be ongoing subscription costs, the costs of new technology that may need to be replaced over time. So they're going to do that district by district and generate a report for each and every district. And in addition, they are looking at their other sources of funding, for example, their title funds, their IDEA, Perkins, whatever it may be, and seeing if they're underspent, which many of them have during COVID, and I think somewhat understandably, but we're concerned about that. There's an ability to roll those funds over. Did you have a question?
And,
Yeah.
right before, I don't think that there's any doubt, at least in my mind and in many of the folks I talked to, that the need that all of that funding was meeting or trying to meet has not gone away.
And will continue.
Will continue at least for the next few years, if not the next like generation of
Yes.
children.
I went
And so when we talk about a fiscal cliff, I want to be really careful to be clear that we're not talking, that the need is ongoing,
Yes.
related to that
Yes.
going away.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have maybe this current contract you just let, we'll explore this, but my feedback anecdotally from my folks in the local education is they have money that they cannot find the personnel.
Absolutely.
And so the stretch out is in acknowledgement of the reality of being able to find specialists for that learning experience that aren't now available.
I 100% agree. If I identified one of three major challenges right now and obstacles that our districts face, the first is their own internal capacity to just be able to manage all of this. Deputy Secretary Boucher likens it to an ostrich egg in a gopher snake's mouth, right? Like they just can't digest it, right? So internally, their capacity, and then just a lack of talent and vendors available to fill the needs that they have. Staffing is a real issue. They are many districts, but not all, are unable to fill their regularly budgeted FTEs, much less the sort of additional surge capacity. So I think that continues to be a major issue.
If I may,
Please.
is that going to run up against the encumbrance
Yes.
problem?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whether there's going to be any give on that because
Yes.
people aren't there.
So this is one of the things that actually Vermont has been really heavily engaged in. The Department of Education in the spring released a letter that was indicating that there may be something called late liquidation, which essentially extends that period. Since that time, they released late liquidation guidance. Remember, ESSER 1 ended on September 30th, and they released the guidance on September 29th. At that point, and you had to have obligated the fund as of that day, right? So at that point, most of our districts had actually already done a great job of expending their funds. And so it did not offer any relief and there wasn't really a need for it. However, all states really, and Vermont's been playing a vocal role in this, have indicated that we need this kind of information for the ESSER 2 and ARP ESSER dollars, and the earlier the better. It will, in fact, have a huge impact in the kinds of decisions that they're making around what they're going to expend their funds on. Ed has not been forthcoming with any information about that. In fact, they seem to be backing away from it a little bit. We've had several calls with the Ed team and have been trying to work with them to understand the path forward. But at this point, our message to our districts is do not plan on it. Don't feel confident in it. Continue to try to spend these funds with urgency. I think that's the only responsible message that we can give them. And we're concerned. We absolutely share your concerns. The district share those same concerns, but it is a federal requirement and there's not much we can do. It would require congressional action to extend the period of performance.
Rep. Taylor?
When you were referring to they and the ed team, that's federal?
Federal, I'm sorry, Department of Education. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question. And so I'll say that also the other side of this contract and this work that we're engaging in, this analysis, I'm excited about this. I think this is sort of critical, actionable information and analysis that we've really been needing, is also an analysis, not just of where you may have fiscal exposure, because exactly as Rep. Kornheiser pointed out, the need is ongoing, right? It's not that on September 30th of 2024, the kids are all better. The pandemic is, all the impacts are done. So the need will be ongoing, and what we want to try to do, and this is part of the analysis, is to identify what's working, right? So where are we seeing a really strong impact for students? And this data is really sort of just now becoming available, right? So you ran that summer program, you ran that after school program. How many more students did you reach? What were the academic impacts? What were the social, emotional, and mental health impacts? Is that something that should continue because it's working? Is there another source of funding that you could identify? Or do you need to make some decisions because you've been funding program X for a long time, but program Y actually works a lot better? So that's also part of this sort of cross analysis that's going to be done. And then also looking at nationally what's working in places that are like our own. A lot of the national calls are like, what's working in, Boston, or what's working in LA County. And we are not that. We don't have that many people. We don't have that same situation. So looking more at what's happening in other rural states, what's happening in places with small populations, what's happening in other places in New England, what's happening in places maybe where, broadband isn't as accessible, and then actually coming up with really clear steps for implementation. It's great to say high dosage tutoring works, but when you don't have people to do it, how can you implement it in our setting? So this work is being done with urgency. I'm actually hoping to have all of these reports done by July of this year.
And then, so I appreciate you saying the urgency. When I think about the budget cycle and planning, how do you see that fitting into districts needing to be drafting?
So it was critical that they get this information before they're really engaged in the FY25 budget. So by late spring, they will have their district level fiscal analysis. Here's where we see.
Late spring of this year.
This year.
Great.
That's the level of urgency. And then also there's going to be a series of conversations happening with districts. Hey, we've seen that you're doing this program. We've seen that this is actually nationally really working well. Tell us about it. What are the student outcomes, right? So really getting back down to, we're making this investment. Here's the student outcomes that we're trying to drive, and it's working. So then we need to start looking at what are we going to do to continue to support this effort beyond 2024. So all of those tools should be in the hands of districts by early summer of 2023, so that as they are building those budgets, starting to have those conversations with their local school boards and looking at FY25, they're armed with information.
Thanks. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but so it sounds as though the schools are going to have a lot of choice about, when they get this data, what they do. What if the Agency of Education decided that there was an initiative, that they thought was so important that they would like to say, this is where we need to go about X topic? Can you talk about that?
Yes, so we have used some of our state level dollars to identify what we think are the really important priorities and initiatives. And we're using those dollars to try to drive action at the local level. So again, recognizing that we only have 10% of the overall funds. So for example, literacy, Act 28 had significant state level funding for literacy professional development and establishment of good literacy practices. And so what are the ways that if we're offering this level of training at the state level and sort of setting some standards around this, what are the ways that the districts can then recognize and leverage their own local dollars? So in some sense, we're trying to put our money to drive what we think are important priorities. The slide deck that I sent does talk about some of those initiatives and what we've said are important priorities. So expanding access to high quality educational experiences. We've invested heavily with our state level dollars in summer, both in partnership with Vermont After School for non-school entities, and then with our own state level grants that we're putting out to our supervisory unions and districts. So we're saying summer And specifically with the most recent round of grants, we said with an element of high dosage tutoring built into it. That's a priority for the state because we know that that works. There's really strong national evidence that it works. So how can they do that? So I'm sort of side answering you because in some sense it's local districts, you know, we can't impose those decisions, but we are trying to drive it with our dollars a little bit.
I won't ask any more deep questions, which I'd love to do because this isn't the committee to do that in. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Around the state, what used to be called voc tech centers, now called career centers, may still be under the aegis of the supervisory union, or they have recently divorced. Where do they fit as a SUSD, since some of them now have their own governance structures and yet have needs and have students who have suffered through COVID?
Absolutely.
What's their pipeline, if you will?
So CTE centers, either the ones that are within an SUSD structure, or we now have, I think, 4 regional tech districts, are not direct recipients of ESSER dollars. So we have strongly encouraged throughout the process that when our SUs and SDs are making these decisions, that they are considering their tech students. Those are their students as well. However, they don't have that direct pipeline. So there is another program that I didn't bring up. That is the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, GEAR. And that is a smaller pot of funds that is available to the governor at his discretion to determine where he wants to prioritize funds. He could do institutes of higher education, school districts, childcare centers. He has really chosen to focus on CTE centers because there was an identified need there. So the first round of funding, which was year 1, it just ended, was really about those like immediate COVID needs, exactly as it was really for ESSER 1 for schools. It was to, hire COVID coordinators, to get technology to be able to send home hands-on materials when students were in remote learning, so they still had access to authentic learning experiences, those kinds of emergency responses. GEAR 2 funds, which are part of the CARISA, so they end this year, have been again directed towards CTE centers with a grant program that is looking at electronic transportation programs and being able to grow that as part of a greater workforce development, but also really high-paying tech jobs. And then also a CTE marketing campaign to be able to raise awareness within districts, within towns about the value of that CTE education. I would point to Jessica Karalis at the Agency of Education. She lives and breathes all of this, so I'm skimming the surface. But I would say there has been that attention and those funds brought to bear, but they do not have direct access to ESSER dollars.
And this committee requested a CTE funding governance report, which I believe we're.
Also the APA team, who I just met with, they're actually in Vermont on the ground right now, doing listening sessions right now. So
the complication that I experience in our divorce in central Vermont is that the sending schools may well be part of a different SU.
Yes. So
it gets more complicated.
It does.
Than just the former host saying, here's my kids, here's a few bucks. It's a very big regional, if you will, exchange of money and students.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'm also eager to see what the funding study comes up with. So, yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to add in the presentation? Representative Bodie?
The slightest question.
You promised.
Yeah, no, it's not about getting into details. You said the governor has money for CTE funding. Has he already said where he wants that to go, or is that coming out of his budget? I missed that part.
So that comes out of the GEAR fund, which is part of the CARES, CARISA. It's all federal pandemic funding.
Yes, but
And the legislature has no control over it.
And has he decided where he wants to put that yet?
Yes.
Is it out?
Yes. And that did actually go through Joint Fiscal Committee approval ages ago. So those are grants, a CTE marketing campaign, and another grant to CTs.
All right, thank you.
So I actually think in the course of our conversation, we actually covered almost everything that I wanted to. So I would say, not surprising to folks, the other big place that schools are investing is in infrastructure. That is tied up with our much larger conversation about school construction and facilities and that kind of debt and backlog that exists. And I work on that as well. So I would always be happy to come in and discuss that further. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much for your.
Thank you all so much.
And we've said to Secretary French once, but I'm happy to repeat it to anyone at AOE. I think it's going to be really helpful going forward to, as you just did, combine the conversation around air quality with PCBs, with school construction, and
Yes.
one big glorious conversation around facilities. Thank you for that.
Couldn't agree more. The complexity of it and the multiple strands are one of the more boggling parts of this, and I work on all of those too. So, all right, thank you so much.
So we're going to take